Everybody, welcome to Keeping Up with the Compliances, Ordinary Mandates, Extraordinary Confusion. Today, we are going to go through a broad range of compliances across industries, just to give everybody a sense of one. There may be one that you did not realize may apply to you. If as an OrbitalFire customer, we'd be touching base with you about these, but we really want to kind of give you the state of the state in a broad view of what to expect, what's coming down, and any changes. So with that, thank you. Reg is in control. So for upcoming webinars, again, thank you so much for attending today. We really appreciate it. For those, and we have notified all of our customers, if we believe and if we know you are part of this, the New York State DFS Amendment Deep Dive is going to be we're going to spend some time really focusing in on that specific change on February 13th webinar. I hope you join us. There'll be another email coming out with a reminder for that registration. We do hope you'll join us for that. And then on March 5th, we hope you'll join us for Size Matters, Cybersecurity Strategies for Small Businesses. And this is really where we're going to take a step back and talk about, really what's the critical pieces and priorities for small businesses to consider when it comes to cybersecurity. So again, please join us. And if you can't, you're always welcome to register, and we will send you the recordings afterwards. That's great. And as you all may have met in the past, Reg Harnish is our presenter today, CEO of OrbitalFire, and he's going to be taking you through with 20 plus years of cybersecurity expertise and a known thought leader in the industry. You're in very good hands today. And with that, as we go through, you'll see at the bottom of or top of your Zoom screen, you'll see a Q&A button. Please, if you have any questions, please enter them there. If we don't get to them right away, we will absolutely make sure that we get to them throughout the presentation. And we want to make sure that your voices, at least your texts, are heard, and that we're answering questions as you go. In addition, as you all know, support at orbitalfire.com. As a customer, you always have access. Please reach out. And even if you are not a customer and you're on here and you're considering us, please feel free to reach out, and we're always happy to continue the conversation afterwards. So, and with that, Reg, do you want to tee this up before we ask some questions?
Sure. Yeah, great. Thanks for the introduction. Thank you for being here today. This is going to be somewhat of a different webinar for us. We have been maybe a little too ambitious, and in preparing for this, we knew that there were quite a few changes that have occurred over the last 12 months or so. I think we were actually underestimating that. And as we got into developing content for this webinar, it became clear that, it's no surprise that people struggle with compliance because, even as folks who have, whether it's 20 years or whatever, I wasn't really prepared for the level of change and just sort of the frequency and pace, and just a lot of complexity out there. I'm going to try and address much of that. This is really sort of a high level, as Dana mentioned. We want to take you through and give you a general sense of just how much has changed over the last 12 months in cybersecurity, give you a starting point for your next step in your compliance journey. And we recognize that everyone has a different path right now. But I think there's a few things that speak generally about this idea of compliance that I wanted to cover first before we jump into some of the major updates. So I know we've got a couple of poll questions here. We kind of wanted to get a sense of where everyone was in their compliance journey, recognizing that every business is different, every industry is different, and everyone's in a different place. So are you confident that you understand what cybersecurity regulations apply to your business? We'll give you a second to respond here. It says yet. Okay, I'm just let's wait for there we go. Okay, thank goodness. hopefully we are reducing the confusion around this topic in some ways. Give it a second here to slow down, and then we have a second question here. We really got to get a sense of what your confidence level is. Like we're coming to a head here. So, okay, so clearly, what is it? 88% of folks either don't know or they're not quite confident that they're pursuing the right compliance mandates and going about it the right way. Okay, question 2. Let's see where this goes. I feel like I'm on Jeopardy.
Yeah, no, let's, and I'm actually I can share those real quick, just so everybody can see. I'm not sure if everybody saw that. All right, and then here you go.
Right, are you confident that you understand what's required of your business to comply? So even if you are, sure of yourself, and like, even if you know what it is that you have to do you feel like you understand what compliance means in that context? Okay, a little better here. Still sort of around the same, close to 90% of you maybe are just shy of being confident or really truly know or understand what it is that's expected of your business. I'm going to end this, share the results so we can see where we are. So hopefully today we can share enough information that at least helps you, even if you're not started, get started. And if you are started, maybe taking that next step. We've got a couple of things. We've been doing this for years now. And I want to just kind of quickly tell a little bit, I don't know if we've shared all this, but, spending at this point a few decades in compliance, we've kind of seen the good, bad, and the ugly. And a few things, let me just keep going here. So I think a couple things are important to recognize is that compliance for us is really sort of a state of defensibility and not necessarily what we would normally do if we truly understood our risk or if we were pursuing a specific goal in cybersecurity. And the compliance landscape continues to change for a number of reasons. So the first is what I call regulatory decay. Some of these laws, most of them are laws, we'll get to a commercial mandate here momentarily, but the laws themselves probably weren't written all that well to begin with. Let's keep in mind it's legislators that write cybersecurity laws. It's not cybersecurity experts. And oftentimes these go a long time without any kind of update. And so the decay that we see is this divergence between the language and the law and what's really happening in the wild, or what's current in terms of our approach and whether it's a best practice or what's generally accepted in the industry. These things start to diverge over time. So I refer to it as decay, but basically these laws become less and less relevant as things in cybersecurity continue to change. Part of it is our responsibility as well, as various industries, we're generally underperforming. And what I mean by that is, I believe that small businesses continue to get better and better at compliance, in understanding it, pursuing it, continuous improvement, et cetera. But generally speaking, because of the changes that occur and the pace at which they occur, we're farther and farther from where we should be. So that's not to suggest that we have more work to do, but rather, I think we're not keeping up. An industry underperformance could also just generally be, we have not reached compliance. I'm going to talk about what that means to me, but we're not doing as well as we had hoped or as what is expected of us. Let's not forget some of this is truly politics at work. And this is, I'm not going to get into the election, but certainly there are folks out there who are writing new laws or updating existing laws because they're running for re-election, or there's a specific, topic in their industry or their state or that warrants conversation, and they're pandering to their constituents. And so we see this at times, and privacy is probably one of those areas where we see a lot of sort of political gesturing and positioning around what's happening. And maybe it has nothing to do with cybersecurity or privacy at all. We have to recognize that that's part of the game. Now, in terms of who must comply, I'm going to cover, well, probably 7 or 8 quickly, and we won't dive too deeply into any one. I'm going to cover a bunch of different mandates, but for each one of those, there's a different scope in terms of who is covered. But generally speaking, if you own or take custody of sensitive data, and this could be personally identifiable information, health records, non-public information like financial records, or let's say unclassified but it's sensitive information as it relates to working with the federal government or perhaps the Department of Defense. If you fall in any one of those categories, you are probably subject to some type of compliance. And that's because there are authorities and regulatory bodies that need to enforce these cybersecurity requirements because we didn't self-govern and we didn't self-mandate. And so we weren't doing a great job. We were underperforming. And so it just invites third-party scrutiny. So, but if you take custody of, or if you create, store, process, or transmit sensitive data, then you are probably subject to some type of compliance. You may also fall under the definition of a covered entity. So most of the laws that I'm going to talk about today, the language is, are you a covered entity? And in some cases, it's very specific, and in some cases, it's a lot more vague. And so whether or not you are an owner or custodian of sensitive data, if you fall under the definition of one of these regulations covered entities, then you're also subject to compliance and really the same requirements. There are non-exempts. So in some cases, these mandates have exemptions for small businesses. One of the great things about being a small business is at times you are exempt from the things that are required of Walmart and Boeing and Raytheon. And that doesn't mean that you don't have to comply. Generally, there are still reporting requirements, and I'm going to talk through each one of those as we are aware of them. But even if you're exempt and really small, don't assume that you're not subject to some kind of compliance. So for example, PCI, the payment card industry, so if you are a merchant processing a single transaction each year, technically you're required to comply with the payment card industry data security standard. And then of course, those of you who probably aren't on this webinar, but those of you who feel like they can get away with this, the reality is you may have rolled the dice for some time. And okay, if that's the business strategy, but generally speaking, that does not, just because you say you're not going to comply and you've gotten away with it, doesn't mean that you're not still subject to these mandates. I'll talk about enforcement because I think at the small end of the market, we have a couple of advantages that I think are important that we should all be aware of. Satisfying compliance, generally, the process is the same, regardless of whether you're an auto dealer or you are, a mortgage lender or broker, or you're manufacturing ball bearings for the Department of Defense. Generally, the process is very similar. The first is inventory your requirements. So understanding what sensitive data you have or where you might be included in a definition of a covered entity, you want to put all those requirements together. And sometimes you might be subject to more than one, right? So if you're a healthcare entity that is also taking credit cards, for example, a very common combination, you've got HIPAA to deal with as well as PCI. So inventory your requirements, that's really where you start. The second is implementing the controls that are required of you. Now, compliance is a journey. And so there is some, I won't say leniency, but there is some grace given to organizations who are committed to compliance, but just aren't there yet. And in my opinion, most organizations are not compliant, and certainly they're not compliant forever. But implementing these controls, that's how you get there, right? And then the last step would be reporting. And generally, in each one of these cases, there's some kind of regular, typically annual, but perhaps in other ways, some reporting that's required of you to talk about or to report on what is the condition or status of your compliance with that particular mandate. So this is just an oversimplification of the process, but generally speaking, this is what you're going to do to get to the point where you can claim compliance. Okay, let's jump in. We've got a lot of ground to cover, and a few of these, there are quite a few changes. I'm starting with New York State DFS because it impacts a significant percentage of our customers, and it's a very broad definition, and there's some good news and bad news, but the New York State Department of Financial Services has updated, and I'll talk about this here in terms of dates. In November of last year, they finally issued or adopted their final rule. It took about 18 months, maybe 2 years for them to decide on exactly what changes they were going to make. But essentially, the New York State DFS cybersecurity rule, it's a set of regulations that governs financial services organizations that are either chartered in if you're a bank, or if your customers or constituents are residents of or businesses chartered in New York State, then you're probably a covered entity. Now, I'm going to talk a little bit about what a covered entity actually means, but in this case, the scope is non-public information. And generally, NPI, non-public information, falls under the financial services umbrella. Financial services organizations tend to call their sensitive data non-public information, and that could be account numbers, first and last names, in some cases an address or an email address. That definition is in flux for all of these regulations just because data continues to, the way that we can, identify individuals changes as well. So who's covered? Well, there's a general statement, anyone supervised by DFS, but that's not super helpful. And if you go through their website, it may not reduce any of this confusion. Now, there are lots of law firms and cybersecurity providers that have provided their own definitions, but let me throw these three up here. These are very common entity types that are covered by New York State DFS that are probably obvious, right? Insurance companies, credit unions, banks, obviously dealing with a lot of financial information, and NPI. Virtual currency is now on there as well, and they added that over the last 2 years because organizations, like exchanges and Bitcoin are now part of the vernacular. They're part of the economy, and they are becoming more tightly integrated with our financial system. But the big one, and where most organizations fall, is in this, what they call financial services companies. Now, this could be a lot of different things, from payroll providers to real estate mortgage or mortgage lenders to title and escrow organizations to a whole bunch of other things. So it's important that you, as either an owner or in a fiduciary or a leader of your organization, really go and figure out, is this something that I'm subject to? There are some surprises. For example, accountants typically are not subject to New York State DFS. And you'd think, well, don't they have access to financial information? Well, for whatever reason, and I can't explain it, but for whatever reason, DFS has decided that they are not a covered entity and that they are not, owners of or custodians for the type of information that DFS feels like they have regulatory authority over. So really, the first one here, the definition of a covered entity is quite confusing. And however, they do have a tool online. So if you go to the New York State DFS website, there is a way for you to find out, am I covered or am I already being supervised? So if you're not an owner, you can check their website and figure out if your organization is already being supervised by New York State DFS. Okay, so what changed? A whole bunch of things. And actually, there's some really good news in here for small organizations. So the first is DFS have really clearly defined that they are primarily interested in large organizations and public companies. They created this Class A entity type, which is really geared towards larger organizations, like large banks that might be chartered in New York State, HSBC or Bank of New York, those types of organizations. And a lot of their focus in the amendment was on huge organizations. So this Class A definition really started to carve out the types of things that small businesses were going to be required to do. In addition, they actually expanded the exemptions for small businesses. Now, they created some confusion. In our webinar next month, we're going to dig into real grainy detail in terms of the timeline for compliance, because it's not all due on the same date. And actually, there's probably a dozen different dates depending on whether or not you're a standard covered entity or what's called an exempt, a limited or full exempt small business. We're not going to have time to get into that detail today, but just know if you are a covered entity under DFS and you're a small business, which almost all of you are, then there's some really good news in terms of exemptions. Now, keep in mind, you may be exempt, but that does not excuse you from reporting and from compliance. It just means that there's a different process and that you are required to do fewer things. But it's important to recognize what those things are. Another global change in the amendment is that DFS is getting very serious, even if you're an exempt organization, a small business, very serious about who is reporting on compliance. They now want to see that fiduciaries, owners, leaders of organizations, CEOs and CISOs, people who can be held accountable for the cybersecurity compliance condition and the status, they want those folks reporting and involved. So not only do they want to see greater or more frequent and depth reporting to the board, if you have one, but also that should be done by the CISO, and that CISO and possibly the CEO are going to be accountable for whatever is disclosed, whatever is reported to DFS. And this compliance status, it's really, they're trying to enforce accuracy and completeness in that condition. So if someone's name is on it and they're legally accountable, the idea is it's going to produce more accurate and complete work. Talked a little bit about this. We're going to see this type of elevation of accountability in most of the regulatory changes that I'm going to talk about today. They're all sort of following suit in the sense that for years, people who might be like an IT manager or someone in HR or like a controller are reporting on these conditions, this compliance status. And they're not happy with that anymore. That's not going to satisfy the requirement. Now, there are some expanded reporting requirements primarily around incidents. So with DFS, they've expanded your reporting requirement to your affiliates, and partners. So up until actually, I think the enforcement date for reporting was last November. I'm going to talk about some important dates here. But now, if you have a supply chain partner that is compromised and they had custody of your NPI or you were taking custody of theirs, and there is what would they call material impact to your business, now you have to report that there was an incident that affected your business, even if that other third party doesn't report. So what they're trying to do is to get the entire industry linked together so that they have better visibility to what kind of incidents are happening under their umbrella. So you now have to report on behalf of other organizations that experience incidents if there's a material impact on your business. That's a huge change. And I think, I believe that we're going to start to see other regulatory mandates follow suit in this case. But of course, there are some expanded technical requirements. And I'd say for small business, it's more of a maturing of those requirements, a better understanding. Again, in some ways, it's good news because we have seen regulations who require outdated controls or weren't allowing common and modern compensations for those controls in a way that it almost hampered your cybersecurity efforts. So good to see that they're updating and that they're starting to keep pace. A great example is passwords, where we still have mandates out there that require a minimum of 8 characters in a password, where we know that best practices are suggesting somewhere 10 or 12 characters minimum. We want to see those things catching up. So we'll talk a little bit about that. Some important dates. Again, it was November last year when the amendment was adopted and became enforceable. December of last year. So the new reporting requirements that I just talked about in terms of reporting on behalf of organizations like an affiliate, maybe a subsidiary of your organization, or a supply chain partner, those reporting requirements were added and were enforceable December 1 of last year. So if you're a DFS covered entity today, you are currently required to report incidents from third parties that materially impact your business. Of course, every year, whether you're a fully exempt or a fully exempt small business or a Class A public company, you have to report by April 15th. That also means that you have to request and have approved your exemptions. You don't just get to not do things. That you still need to work with get the approval for those exemptions. So for those of you who are of limited or full exemption, that's a two-step process. Get your exemptions approved and then do your reporting on April 15th. And of course, for most standard covered entities, you're going to be reporting on your compliance status across the entire framework. And then later this year, and again, the really expanded and honestly complex and confusing timeline. I think DFS really had the best of intent when they went into this to make it a more gradual transition to these new technical requirements, but there's so many dates that we couldn't possibly go through it here today. Next month, we're going to go through this in detail, but just keep in mind things like risk assessments and penetration testing. If you're not already doing them and you're a standard covered entity, that's something that you're going to have to do among other things as well. Okay, let's switch gears here to merchants, or really anyone who accepts payment in any way. I think the industry has evolved really intelligently in the sense that it's become very easy to completely outsource your payment processing to third parties. However, that doesn't absolve you of your compliance requirements. And so not only is reporting required, but you really have to understand a confusing set of requirements as there are multiple different merchant levels, and there are multiple types of what we call self-assessments or assessments. And really depending on how you're taking cards, whether it's like an in-person point of sale device sitting on a counter, or people are keying in payment transactions over the phone, or you just have a website where people can come and buy your product or service. Each one of those requires a different approach to compliance. However, one thing continues to be true, and maybe even more true than it ever has been, and it's what we call scope reduction. So for all of you, as you're thinking about your PCI compliance effort, the magic wand, the crown jewels, the secret sauce to compliance is minimizing your exposure or access to the payment processing at all. And again, it's become so easy in most cases to outsource to third parties every part of your payment processing that's really the first step. So before you ever implement a control, one of the things you'll want to do is have a conversation with us or someone to decide, what can I change in my infrastructure or my web application to reduce my scope and my requirements around PCI? Let me give you a sense. So the smallest assessment, so if you reduce scope really well, there are 22 questions per year that you're going to need to answer. Now, you need to document it, et cetera, but 22 questions. In the worst case, the largest assessment is 344 questions, I believe. So almost 20 times as much work if you haven't done a good job reducing scope. All right, let's jump in. So 4.0 PCI DSS, the PCI data security standard, has been around for some time. What is it? So basically any merchant that accepts or is essentially accountable for a single payment card transaction per year is subject to the PCI data security standard and the compliance effort. So we know that most of you are not dealing in millions of card transactions, and most of the merchant levels start at 6 million or less. everyone falls into that merchant level, and then they go up from there. And so my guess is that almost everyone on here, if you're taking payment cards, you're in that first merchant level. And that means that you are processing 6 million or less, fewer than 6 million credit card transactions per year. But even if you are, you're subject to this. So who's covered? Essentially, anyone who creates, stores, processes, or transmits payment card information or payment transaction information. So they have sort of two buckets of sensitive data. One is the card and the card holder itself. The second is the transaction, so the actual usage of that information. So both of those are in scope. Really, two common types of small businesses. Most of our customers who are subject to PCI they're merchants, and that may be someone with a Shopify website. It may also be a healthcare provider that takes credit cards at their counter, but they're merchants. They're selling something, and they are processing or responsible for those payment transactions themselves. Also, payment processors, so folks who are involved in the chain. So if you are a hosting provider that essentially builds websites for your customers, but in your websites that you're hosting, if part of that is payment transaction infrastructure, APIs, libraries, other things, then you're also considered part of that payment processing chain, and you're also subsequently subject to PCI compliance. So what's changed over the last, well, in this case, more than 12 months ago? So multi-factor password requirements is a great example. So they've expanded their password requirements to 12 characters. Keep in mind that this is payment card industry, or PCI 4.0 that we're referring to now. The old version was PCI 3.2.1. And again, since then, they have introduced enhanced technical requirements. Encryption, not only are you required to encrypt data that you may store, but now there's enforcement and some changes in the type of encryption that is considered acceptable or the way it's deployed. I kind of skipped over multi-factor here. Something important is in 3.2.1, multi-factor was required for anyone who is accessing payment card or transaction information, but now it's essentially carte blanche. You need multi-factor on anything that's in scope, any asset that's in scope. So if you have PCs, if you have network devices, everything requires multi-factor. So they've expanded that. They've also restricted the use of shared accounts even farther. So similar to multi-factor, where it existed in the old version of PCI, but now in the new version, they are more strictly enforcing shared account prohibition across a greater percentage of that scope. And then for your annual compliance activity, there's really two documents, at least two documents, that you'll be responsible for, or we can help you with, of course. The assessment itself, so that's where you go through and answer yes or no to all of your compliance and your controls that are in place. And then there's an attestation on compliance, which is a separate document, basically needs to be signed now by like a fiduciary or your CISO or your CEO. So all of those have changed to reflect the new requirements as well. So that has changed. So if you're just using or trying to reuse the 3.2.1 documentation, that's not really going to work. A couple of important dates. So this has been out for a while, right? We're in 2024 now. So the grace period has been in effect since March 31 of 22. Now, 2 years later, it will be enforced. So if you are or have been going through a PCI compliance process each year, recognize that if you do it after March 31st, that you're going to be required to attest utilizing the 4.0 framework, as well as the 4.0 documentation, the assessment questionnaire, as well as the attestation. Now, actually, the other requirements for 2024 are pretty lightweight. There's not a whole lot of technical requirements or additional requirements that have changed. And many of the ones that I've mentioned are future dated. So you have until next year, March 31st, to comply. Things like multi-factor encryption, shared account usage, things like that. Those changes, you still have another year or so to get compliant with. So again, I think about these compliance updates. There's generally some grace period for you to transition into the newly implemented updates, and PCI is no exception. All right, moving on to FTC safeguards. So FTC, Federal Trade Commission, is interested also, similarly to DFS, they're interested in protecting financial transactions. Over the years, the scope and what is defined as a covered entity for FTC has expanded significantly. Now, keep in mind, FTC is actually a subset of the Gramm-Leach-Bliley Act, the GLBA, from many years ago. And I actually don't remember what year that was introduced, but it was probably a decade and a half ago, maybe more. But what is it? Again, so non-public information around financial transactions. One of that's important to recognize, especially with these federal level mandates, is that generally speaking, there is a carve out for organizations who are subject to other federal regulations. So, for example, FTC says, hey, listen, you're subject to FTC, unless you're subject to the SEC requirements, for example. So just to add to some confusion, in terms of, what is it that you have to do? When do I have to do it, et cetera. It applies to really anyone, any organization that's, directly or indirectly involved in financial transactions or may take custody of financial information. So some examples, financial services is always out there, of course, but also like auto dealerships. You would be surprised at how much money a car dealer is actually moving each year. In some cases, it might be tens of or hundreds of millions, billions of dollars, even though they might be a small car dealership. And so they are covered, and there are others as well. In this case, accountants and tax preparers are specifically covered under FTC, and there's a long list of others. I put these up there because most of our customers that are subject to FTC are really fall into one of these three categories. What's changed? With FTC, it was really a lot about enforcement. And when you look at what's required, if you go through the actual controls inventory or what's being required today, it's not significantly different than what was required a year ago. However, there's a lot more visibility to it. And so we call it enhanced enforcement, but we've, there's a lot more visibility to it. So we're seeing a lot of growth in auto dealers who are, I won't say panicked, but concerned about what their requirements are. This may have been the first time that they were aware of cybersecurity requirements in their industry, but there are others as well. And so again, enforcement, we're sort of in a wait and see, holding pattern here in terms of what do we think the Federal Trade Commission is going to do to enforce this. We're not really sure, but they've certainly done a good job of amping up the volume on visibility and just making people aware of these new requirements. One thing that is very common across DFS, PCI, I'm going to talk about SAC momentarily, FTC, is everyone wants to know what's happening in terms of cybercrime to these organizations. So there are specifics. You may also have more stringent requirements if it's ransomware. So some of these regulations have actually carved out ransomware as a specific type of incident. And if you are, they call it extortion as a sort of a general category of cybercrime. If you're involved in an extortion attack or an incident, then you may need to report that sooner than other types of incidents. So again, really would be useful to go through and make sure you understand these. FTC is no different though. So they're really putting a lot of focus on the reporting of cybercrime. Financial fraud is killing small businesses right now. Honestly, we don't really see any ransomware with our customers. I say any, very little of it, but financial fraud still continues to be a problem for organizations of all sizes. So keep in mind that those reporting requirements have changed. So FTC update went into effect last summer. That was including a 6-month delay. It was actually originally intended for December of 22. was pushed back until June 9th. There was a bunch of speculation and, concern about some of the requirements that were in there. And I think they rolled some of those back, but it was really summer of last year. The breach reporting is being enforced starting May of this year, including non-financial organizations that may be considered covered entities as well. Okay, the SEC, a whole bunch of language here, very similar to FTC in the sense that most of the technical requirements existed, but maybe didn't exist for smaller organizations. So this really is the investment side, the market side of financial transactions. So unlike PCI, which is talking about purchases, and FTC, which is talking about the actual financial transaction and maybe like money, wiring money and things like that, this is really more on the investment side of financial transactions. So some examples of who's covered, really anyone they consider a market participant, but typically they look like this. So wealth managers, financial advisors, brokers, anyone who's sort of involved in that part of the supply chain, investors themselves, investment companies are all subject to these SEC cybersecurity rules. And of course, the exchanges themselves, they're probably not on this webinar. What's changed? Again, similar to the FTC, where many of the requirements existed prior, but now enforcement has really been amped up. There was a whole campaign in the summer of last year leading up to the adoption of a new amendment, which basically said, we're getting serious about enforcement in the SEC. So especially if you're a financial investment firm, there's been a lot of visibility in your industry around, what do we need to do for SEC cybersecurity? So enforcement has really been amped up. And again, similar to FTC, the SEC wants to know if and when impacting incidents have occurred, right? And this goes all the way up to public companies where there are special forms that have to be reported on. And basically what they're looking for is any criminal activity that could impact, let's say, the valuation or the capitalization of a public company, or the capitalization or valuation of a smaller organization. And that has to do with not only the organizations themselves, but also the people who are involved in that investment supply chain. So let's say you owned, Capital One. Your stock price is a valuable thing. So if something happens to Capital One, if they have an incident that affects their stock price, that's a big deal. But if something happens in the stock trading supply chain that affects Capital One also has to report, as well as the sort of initially affected organizations. Confusing, yes, but there are some answers out there, and we're starting to see more precedent too. So for folks like us, where we're constantly trying to keep up with these changes, one of the things that helps is seeing how these requirements and the amendments are interpreted by the industry, and at least gives us a defensible position to be in. So a couple of important dates for SEC, and I'm going to move on to a few smaller, minor updates. So the new rule was adopted, again, last summer, similar time frame to the FTC, and then incident disclosure requirements. So they often use different terms, but they're all referring to the same thing, which is if you have an incident or you are involved in an incident that could affect the stock price or share price or its valuation, capitalization of an organization, those things need to be reported. Call them sort of materially impactful. Okay, so let's talk about a few other things here, because those are the big ones that we're dealing with right now, but there are a host of others. So if you are in manufacturing and you happen to be in the DoD supply chain, keep in mind that actually both DFARS and CMMC are sort of in flux right now. DFARS because NIST 171 is undergoing updates to revision 3. So those 110 controls that you're focused on today, those are in the process of changing. Revision 3 is actually in the comment period right now, and we would expect that to settle down over the next 6 months. And usually there's a couple of weeks for the amendments to make it into the Federal Register. So that we're still months away from revision 3 and changes to 171, but it is coming. Similarly with CMMC, another manufacturing DoD, federal government mandate, that's still a bouncing ball in a similar situation as DFARS in the sense that they're in comment period right now. We know that there's going to be changes. That's been made very clear. So, and I think with CMMC, some of them will be more impactful than what might be happening with DFARS. Another one, so privacy, which is very different than cybersecurity, is something that we are often dragged into because we're very familiar with what privacy is and what good privacy actually looks like. However, most privacy is really a legal function. So while security is about protecting the confidentiality, integrity, and availability of data, privacy is really more concerned with what are you doing with the data after it's secured, right? So what data are you collecting from your patients or constituents, customers? What are you doing with it? Are you selling it? Are you sharing it? What access does your customer have to their data? We see something very interesting happening with the privacy rule. So for healthcare providers, the HIPAA privacy rule, you're going to need to be able to provide access to your patients in a way that they can physically in person walk in and see it and take a picture of it, which should be interesting. So privacy is changing with the HIPAA privacy rule. I don't have a great sense of when we expect that to be amended or be adopted, but we'll keep you posted. Even though we're not technically a privacy firm, we are helping some customers with policy statement, privacy policies and privacy statements. And so we are aware of that. Secondly, we have a real density of customers in California, believe it or not. And so we know that the California legislature is getting ready or has already introduced the CPRA, the Privacy Rights Act, which supersedes the prior Privacy Act, which I think was the California Consumer Privacy Act or something like that. So the CPRA replaces and supersedes that former privacy law. And then, of course, there are other state laws that are changing constantly. New York and California tend to lead the pack in terms of security and privacy, and usually other states start to follow suit. So the New York State DFS requirement, which is actually a state level, it's not federal, that legislation is likely to be adopted, or something very similar likely to be adopted by other neighboring states or states that you might be operating in as well. So not only do you have to keep track of the big federal regulations, but also the state laws are changing constantly. So it becomes compliance soup, and trying to keep track of these things can be challenging. All right, so a couple of final thoughts here. Because we do, probably 40% of our work and what we focus on with customers is either compliance or compliance related, meaning either the compliance management, the compliance assessments, risk assessments, and then subsequent remediation to become compliant. That's a very, very big part of our business today. So we spend a lot of time trying to remain fluent, if not expert, in these different areas. So a couple of things I think are going to be important for everyone here is that compliance has taken on a new, what's the right word? A new something. In the sense that years ago, let's say 15 years ago, maybe 20 years ago, when I first got involved in cybersecurity, compliance was a hurdle over which you must clear, right? So it was very binary. There wasn't a lot of wiggle room or negotiation around compliance. Here's what we require of you, and you will do this, or or you will be subject to penalties, or ineligible for bidding on that RFP, whatever it was. Today, it's very different. And in my opinion, and certainly my experience, no one is compliant today. And I spent, almost 15 years working with Fortune 10,000 organizations who are spending millions of dollars in cybersecurity every year and running their compliance management programs. It became very clear that not only were they not compliant, but they were never going to be compliant. Too much surface area, too much complexity, too much stuff. However, at the small end of this market, right, for a 25, 50, 200 person organization, compliance is actually achievable. Not only that, along the way, most of the regulatory authorities have figured out, yeah, no one's compliant, and some of them never will be. So how do we change the goal so that it's achievable, so we don't just see people walking away from this? And so we have, and they have really sort of refocused on this idea of continuous improvement. One of the things that we really counsel our customers on constantly is, if this is not a beauty contest, you're probably not compliant today, and maybe you'll never be compliant. But to be in a defensible position, we want to make sure that there's a commitment to a compliance program, and that year over year, you're showing appropriate improvement. And that looks different for every one of our customers. Every business on the planet is going to have a different journey. It's going to come down to, what industry are you in? What are your peers doing? What types of incidents have you experienced? All sorts of things. But just keep in mind that being compliant, while I won't say it's not the goal, it's no longer binary. And it's no longer a black and white conversation. There's a lot of gray area there. Prioritizing your efforts is going to be very important. Again, with moving targets like this, keep in mind, we're still dealing with ransomware and financial fraud and other things, contractual requirements I'll talk about momentarily. So the goal line keeps moving. So it becomes more and more important that you prioritizing your efforts. And the way you do that is through an assessment, an effective risk assessment, and by recognizing that the best approach here is to address your highest risk items first. Now, anyone who is an assessment customer here at OrbitalFire, you're getting prioritized risks and recommendations every year from us. And it's important that you think about risk as part of your strategy, right? So prioritization means understanding your risk and then ensuring or committing to doing the highest risk items first, or dealing with those risks first. It also can save you time, money, and energy, because you're going to get the biggest bang from addressing those high risk items. And so if you're following the process and you're committed to that strategy, you're most likely to be developing value in your cybersecurity program. So prioritization equates to value, right? Creating a cybersecurity program that is truly an asset to the business. We haven't talked a bit about contractual requirements. And oftentimes, and in particular industries for sure, healthcare and manufacturing come to mind, because in healthcare, there's something called a business associate agreement, where you may be subject to things that go well beyond the HIPAA security rule or the HIPAA privacy rule, but they're in a contract that you've agreed to, and aware of those. Similarly in manufacturing. So after you have built your compliance program around your primary framework, let's say it's the HIPAA security rule, now it's time to expand your program to look at those contractual requirements, because you don't want to lose your best customer or your best supply chain partner just because you're not meeting their requirements, even if you are 100% compliant with the security rule. And again, that concept really applies to every industry: financial services, real estate, law, manufacturing, pretty much everything. Your contracts may be more stringent than your regulatory requirements. So it's really important that you understand what they are and you have a plan to include those in your assessment and compliance program. Of course, we can help. Not going to make this a commercial. You're all customers or friends of customers. And everything that we've talked about so far, these are the frameworks that we're dealing in and working in every single day. And in some cases, in particular, healthcare, manufacturing, and like New York State DFS, I mean, a really big percentage of our customers, maybe 80% of them, fall in one of those three categories. So please let us know if we can help, even if it's just you want to bounce a question off us, or you want to implement an entire compliance program to be a compliant healthcare provider that takes credit cards, for example. Okay. We got about 5 minutes left. I have not been looking to see if any questions have come in, but Dana, I will turn it back over to you and happy to answer any questions.
That's great, Reg. Thank you so much. I know there was a lot to cover there of really valuable information. And as Reg just asked, if there's any questions, please use the Q&A or even the chat and let us know. We can get everybody a moment.
Yeah, one of the questions we usually get is, our slides available? Of course, all of our customers get access to all of our content. In the slides themselves, there are also a bunch of links to online resources if you want to go out and do some of your own research, whether it's DFS or PCI. All of that information is generally open source and publicly available. So if that was your question, for sure that information is out there. Generally speaking, we have access to the same information that you do. So it's really just a matter of finding it and interpreting it and understanding it.
Okay, and I will, within a day or two, we will send this presentation, the recording, to everybody. We're happy to do that. Okay. Reg, it sounds like you've answered everyone's questions.
Yeah, we don't want to put you on the spot. If you have questions, please either info@orbitalfire.com or contact your customer success specialist or support@orbitalfire.com. Those will all get to us if you've got general questions. I'm going to give you my email address too, just in case you had something specifically for me. Thank you again for your time today. It's been a busy hour and probably dizzying and confusing. It's unbelievable what's going on in cybersecurity. And the more you dig into it, the more we're surprised at just how often and how significantly these requirements are changing. And so we'd love to help.
And just again, for the New York State DFS, we will have one specifically about that to go even deeper on February 13th. And please, keep an eye out for your emails. We continually have these webinars to help continue to educate, and we hope you'll join us in the future.
Thanks, everyone.
Have a good day. Thanks.